In this area, basically, we're going to cover business continuity and disaster recovery planning. And the key thing to know is disaster recovery planning is going to be for your IT infrastructure, and it is part of business continuity planning, or the BCP. Okay, business continuity objectives. Need for a plan and its obstacles, a BIA, business impact analysis, identifying vulnerabilities and threats, roles of business continuity plan, recovering solutions of an offsite options, and then types of BCP testings. Okay, in this area, there's disaster recovery and business continuity. Disaster recovery is how to survive a disaster, what to do right after the disaster. It's usually for the IT operations themselves. And business continuity focuses on how the company can stay in business even in a crippled state. Okay, business continuity planning. First step, of course, is going to be understanding what the business needs are, what's important to the business. And you get that usually through a BIA. The PCM strategies, then you develop the responses to specific entities or items, establish the continuity culture, and then, of course, exercising planned maintenance. And the thing is, with the planned maintenance, a lot of times things change, legislation changes, the environment or cultures changes, so you may have to go through this process over and over again. Okay, project initiation. Of course, with every project, you need to gain the support of upper management. To gain support, business case must be made. There's a cost-benefit analysis. There's regulation requirements, especially if you're dealing with some of the bigger regulations. It's going to be, for example, you may have to have certain items backed up and also certain items secured. Key ramifications of other companies not implementing the plan. Then business issues of partners, insurance, and obtaining capital. Okay, senior management. Senior management's role is, of course, your due diligence and due care, because when it comes down to it, if there is no BCP in place, if the system were to, for example, if there was an earthquake in the organization and it made it to where during the process of going from one site to another site, for example, a hot site or a warm site, if the data was released to the public or if it was stolen from point A to point B, that's going to be a huge issue. There's also drive all phases of the plan, consistent support and final approval of the plan. And the main reason they need consistent support and final approval because they're the ones that are going to be going to jail if anything bad happens, because they're the ones that are ultimately responsible for the organization. Ensure that testing takes place and also construct a budget for this to work. Again, that goes back down to due care and due diligence, because if there's no budget, you can't do anything.
Quick question. This is kind of throughout the training manual and the way you describe things. When you talk senior executive management, you talking C-level?
Yes.
I mean, I just want to, and they'll refer to senior executive management on the test that way? Or do they?
Yeah, like, for example, C-level execs, and then also board members too. Because if there are boards, then the C-level exec's still probably going to be responsible like the CEO, but board members are also going to be. So sometimes the CEO does not get to do anything without the blessing of the board. So therefore, as long as they document everything, just like middle management would, then they should be relatively safe. So, but yes, that's the top of the line that they look for is C-level. Okay, BCP team. This is made up of several different areas within the business. At minimum, these key personnel should include representatives from each organization within each department, very similar to your basic risk analysis, because you want to make sure that everybody's taken account of. Representatives from key support departments, IT representatives with technical expertise, because they're the ones that are going to say that, yes, the plans that you have in place will actually not work because the technology won't support it, or it will support it. Security representatives. Why would you want security representatives in a BCP plan?
Because those are the ones that are going to assist you with identifying your weaknesses and the security approach.
They're going to be holding the bag when things go south.
Yes, because that's another interesting thing is that when an organization is during a disaster, it still has to protect everything the way it would be when it's not in a disaster. So again, if private information or sensitive information were to get out during that time period, it would still be a huge black eye to the organization. Also legal representatives and of course senior management. And a lot of times you also have, it doesn't really have here, but you have your HR and your PR. HR for human resources to make sure that everybody's taken care of as far as the employee level. There's also logistics, and then PR. So whenever bad things happen, they can spin it in a good light. Okay, since 9/11, unfortunately, did change a lot of BCPs. There were a lot of organizations that didn't have say a hot site, warm site, or a remote site. Their remote site was the other tower. So when both of them went down, unfortunately, killed the entire business. With that being said, the majority of the organizations that didn't have like global reach or offices all over the world, off-site backups, they were out of business, even if their main site was elsewhere, because the majority of their content was in that location. And then also the issue too with the BCP is the human factor. It's probably the most important, or is the most important part of a BCP. Is you have to do human safety first, data safety second. Okay, in this area we're going to cover the BIA, or Business Impact Analysis. There's maximum tolerable downtime, which is basically something you have to memorize, vulnerabilities and threats, and then loss criteria. Okay, plan development delegated to a committee. You're going to look at your BCP committee, a group that will carry out risk and assessment and analysis. Of course, there's representatives from each different company departments. Analysis must be carried out before the plan is developed. A BCP coordinator must be established to oversee and execute the BIA, the plan development and implementation, and testing and plan maintenance. And why is testing and plan maintenance a huge portion of your due care and due diligence?
If you backed up your servers and your backups really don't work.
Right. That's one big issue, is that data backups, testing those to make sure that they actually do back up, they do work, that you can restore it, in a reasonable time. The good old fire drills that everybody goes through, that's a basic one, because buildings unfortunately do catch fire sometimes, and if you don't train people on what to do and not to panic, a lot of times people will go the wrong direction, get stuck in a building, and then bad things can happen. And then another fun thing is that whenever you put a BCP in place, even a DRP or whatnot, chances are it'll never work the first time. You're going to find all kinds of things. For example, say you have a DRP, or the small portion of the BCP, and an emergency happens. You've gone through your tabletop test, but you haven't actually gone through a full-blown test your upstream providers, and it comes down to that the upstream telco didn't actually turn your T1 on or turn your extra connection on, so you can't get outside of your organization because you turned off one router, but it didn't flip to the next one. Everything's working on your side, but the third parties are not up to par, not doing their job, or the third parties are on the same exact line when the disaster does happen. For example, the last mile. I know a lot of telcos will basically share costs or whatnot, to where the prime is going to hold the big backbone that goes to the last mile, and then multiple people will be reselling that last mile. So even though you have two different organizations, you still have the same physical pipe. And then, of course, on paper, it can be perfect, but during an emergency, a lot of people's minds just aren't on the game. Either A, they could be fearing for family, so that's something that also needs to be taken into consideration. So you train people enough to where, of course, family, personal life, that is the most important. So if certain people get taken out of the mix, other people have to step up to the plate and still keep the organization valid. Okay, BIA. You need to identify the company's critical business functions. You have to identify resources these functions depend upon. You have to calculate how long these functions can be without resources. You have to identify vulnerabilities and threats to these functions. Calculate risks for each different business function. Develop backup solutions for resources based on the tolerable outage times. And also develop recovery solutions for the company's individual departments and for the recovery of the company as whole. What that basically means, for example, if you have a manufacturing organization, if that's the big bread and butter of the company, you may have to get that up running in first, and then HR might be another one, or payroll would be another one that's very important to get up and running as quickly as possible, especially if you do payroll once a week. But if, for example, if you do payroll once a month, if you just went through payroll, you may be able to squeak another week or so out to get that department up. if you still have 3 weeks to go. But again, depending on the validity of the different department and how much it's going to be worth to the organization. Okay, types of analysis. Just your basic risk analysis as well. You have your qualitative and quantitative. Which one's going to be the numeric? Quantitative. And qualitative is going to be the opinion-based. That's the decisions making non-numeric factors such as emotions, investor and customer confidence, workforce stability, and other concerns, so forth. That's the non-numeric. Okay, some key terms. You have the maximum tolerable downtime, or MTD. This is maximum length of time the business function can be inoperable without causing irreparable harm to the business. You'll have a lot of the MTDs for specific items as well, is that it's going to cost, or it's going to hit a specific time, or it's going to cost more than that asset is going to be able to make for the organization. So at that time, you can basically call it as a dead entity. Okay, some of the risks. Of course, there's the natural threats. Even though that fires and explosions, those could be both man-made and natural. For example, if you live in specific areas of the U.S., there's a lot of wildfires. I know, for example, California, Montana, places like that, lots of forests, basic things like lightning hit, cause a forest to catch fire. And then as soon as it hits, for example, a plant or manufacturing plant or a fireworks plant, it's going to cause huge explosions. There's, of course, terrorists. This is not going to be your natural. This is going to be your man-made. So then other ones, of course, there's the man-made threats. The fires and explosions can be versatile because it could be, for example, forest fire hits an organization. The building collapses, same thing. Usually, for example, that could be man-made, and technically that could cross over to natural. For example, if there is an earthquake and the organization hasn't built a building for it. However, that probably goes back to the due diligence portion because they more than likely didn't build the building up to specs if the building crashed. Because I know a lot of the places that are in known earthquake areas do have to build their buildings for their certain amount of sway for certain sized earthquakes. However, unfortunately, just like Katrina, there's only so much that people usually plan for. And if there's waves or if there's a higher class hurricane or higher class earthquake than the building was actually built for because they weren't expecting it, then of course it's going to cause lots of issues. Then again, avalanches, there's only a few places that you'd really have to worry about that, and it does require some amount of snow. Okay, identifying functions and resources. Which of the items are critical for certain functions to run? You're looking at specific types of technologies. I know when a lot of people have some sort of hot site, what they'll end up doing is have a lot of technology on that site, but then they'll start doing it to where trying to cut back money, they won't be doing the updates as much as they should. Or, for example, if they upgrade everything to the newest OS, latest and greatest Unix or Windows or whatnot, they may not update it at the hot site in time, so when a disaster does happen, then they have to move back to technology. Good old backups, for example, your zip disks, some of the ones that are less popular nowadays as they used to be, just because the size. Sometimes you'll have a lot of backups on a specific media, and then on your hot site, you don't have the older technology, you just have the new stuff because you don't think that you'll have to go back 2-3 years. But if your backup does fail or data is damaged in a way where you actually do have to go back 2 years worth of data or 5 years, 10 years, a lot of times the little things in life make things more difficult. There's also necessary software. Again, if you have a payroll system or let's say if you're running QuickBooks or whatnot, Great Plains or whatnot, it's always good to have backup copies, especially if you have a hot site at the hot site. Communication mechanisms. You know, as I mentioned before with the last mile, most organizations need some way to communicate with the rest of the world through an internet. Some people have it to where they have a backup with an ISDN line, so it's a small pipe, but at least it's a pipe because it's going to be going over the tippet rings, as opposed to your basic like DSL or T1. Electrical power, safe environment for workers. It's a huge issue as well because human life is going to be the most important portion of a business. And also access to specific outside entities. What would be some examples of outside entities that would be relatively important for BCP?
It's electric power, I was
Yep.
considering.
Utility companies, emergency companies, fire, police.
Some places have vendors running processes for them.
Yep. Vendors, I know, for example, Cisco used to have a 24-hour dropship policy, so if anything bad happened to your systems, you could RMA and they just send you one within 24 hours up and running.
I think if you have a contract big enough, usually they set shop nearby.
Yeah,
Like I know they'll have reps near the Pentagon, I guess.
yeah.
Respond and stuff like that.
So that's a huge one because a lot of people do the warm sites, so they don't have all the equipment. So what they'll end up doing is get huge contracts with vendors. So if anything bad happens, they'll instantly have 500 to 1,000 computers physically at a location. And again, the more computers you have, the longer it's going to take you to get up and running. But it's one of those scenarios where, yeah, vendor support's very important. I know small things too. For example, if you have proprietary equipment, that's going to make things a lot longer and a lot more difficult to get back up and running. So if you have your generic vendor, your generic equipment, that's going to be good. I know for as far as like forensics and stuff goes, a lot of times they have it where it's more beneficial if you start the investigation or start everything in the early mornings, especially on a weekday. Because if you start it at nights and weekends, a lot of times you may come across a scenario where they have older equipment and you just don't have the cables for it, or you don't have the input for it, and then you have to go to your local Circuit City, Best Buy, or CompUSA type scenario to get a special part, especially with cell phone forensics. A lot of times you have to have the special cables for the special phone, and if you don't have it, you have to go to a cell phone store. And a lot of times they may or may not be open on weekends or after business hours. Then also, of course, you have your physical production environment, network production environment, specific supplies, and interdepartmental communications, assuming that they were good to begin with. Okay, likelihood assessment. This is a huge issue too, because if you live in an area to where there hasn't been an earthquake in 120 years, chances are when you're doing the BIA, yeah, you may think of that saying, yes, the last earthquake 120 years ago was 3 on the Richter scale, so it's probably not going to damage us too much. But we have fires in the nearby forests every year. The one with the fires, one you're going to have to, or it's more logistically feasible to practice for that one and still keep the potential earthquake in the back of your mind, but you always want to do a likelihood assessment. Some events occur much more often and are more likely to happen than others. Basically, this is expressed in terms of annualized rate of occurrence, back to the ARO. So everybody remember that good old algorithm, the ALE? Okay. Cool. Because you have the exposure factor, which is the amount of damage that the risk poses to the asset. Your single loss expectancy is the monetary loss that is expected each time the risk materializes. You have your ALE, which is your analyzed loss expectancy. Basically comes down to you have your ALE and then your inner rate of occurrence, which is if you have a fire once every 30 years, it's going to be 0.03. So it's, that's just basic 10 math, or base 10 math. For example, for building fire, impact analysis is going to be 70%. If you have a $500,000 building, each time a fire is going to happen once every 30 years is going to be $350,000. So it's not unnatural or unnormal to spend the 350 divided by 30 per year, or up to that amount, to secure against it. Okay, non-monetary impact. Again, there's social ethical responsibilities to the community. Back in Montana, for example, there were a couple strip mines, which basically go into the area and then even put cyanide in the area to clean up the, I guess, minerals to get to the specific things they wanted to. What was funny about it was that these people's mindset was that, yeah, we'll poison the area, destroy the area, and then instead of cleaning it up, we'll just declare bankruptcy. And the same people opened up a new company and then did the same thing over and over and over again. So it was multiple times. It was over half a dozen times that they did this until the government finally came in and say, we know who you are. You're the same people that did this last time. You're now responsible criminally and financially for repairing this one individual lake that they had so much cyanide. Whenever birds would touch the lake, it would almost instantly die. So there's all kinds of issues there. So that was a social, ethical responsibility to clean up the environment in that space. What was that?
Take the kids to the lake, huh?
Yeah. Because not only is the lake poisoned because of chemical poisoning, but now you have biological poisoning as well. There's also negative publicity, because again, now the public knows. Now they don't like those individuals. Okay, subscription services. There's the hot, the warm, and the cold sites. You need to know the difference between each. The common rule of thumb is that a hot site is going to take hours to get up. The warm site is going to take days, and a cold site is going to take weeks. That's the primary thing as far as rule of thumb on time length. However, how many people have military background? A lot of times you'll come across to where people do a cold site, and they can get it up in literally hours. But from a commercial standpoint, a cold site usually is going to take weeks to sometimes months. So that's one thing, is that you have to find the organization, you have to find the building, you have to make sure the floors are raised, you have to bring in contractors to do all the construction, then you have to bring in the equipment, build the equipment. But yeah, it's the hours, days, and then weeks. Okay, non-subscription options. You have reciprocal agreements. You have a redundant site, your rolling hot site, and prefabricated buildings. The reciprocal agreement is something that a lot of organizations have done in the past, but if you do, make sure the contract is ironclad. I've seen a lot of scenarios to where it's a first come first served basis, because one company will have a reciprocal with, let's say, 5 or 6 of the companies. If there's a geographical event that affects all 5 companies, it's going to be the person that basically either gets there first or pays the most. So the other people are just going to be out of luck. There's also the issue to where when you do the reciprocal agreement, you may do the contract with them. They have a building that can hold 1,000 people. They only have 200 people using the building, and you have 6. So there's still some room for growth on both sides. But they may double or triple their organization, so when the emergency finally happens, they only have half the space for you. So that's another issue, is that whenever you do reciprocal agreements, make sure that they are holding up their end of the bargain. Of course, redundant site, just multiple locations. Rolling hot site, I know a lot of organizations will have it to where they have dual processing. So the multiple sites are basically 2 different entities. They're still the same organization, but they're working separately, maybe doing backups back and forth to each other. But then the rolling hot site is that data is going to both locations at the same time. So if one gets hit with a geographic event and they're no longer a viable organization or a viable entity, the secondary instantly becomes up and running. Okay, resource prioritization. Creates a list of all the risks you analyzed during the BIA process and sorts them in a descending order by the annualized loss expectancy. This, the result is a quantitative or qualitative analysis. This may be justified. A risk is having a higher priority on the business impact. Again, it comes back down to, let's say, payroll versus customer access. If you're doing a once every month payroll, it may be more important to get the customer access up and running immediately so you can start generating the revenue, because you still have 2 to 3 weeks for the payroll. Okay, continuity strategies. Continuity strategies and planning basically focuses on the development of implementation of a continuity strategy to minimize the impact, realizing risk that might have occurred to an asset or the asset that needs protecting. Things to look for, of course, are going to be your people. That's going to be your first priority. Because, for example, if the organization's on fire, you need to minimize the loss of life and get everybody out immediately. There's also buildings and facilities, and then, of course, your infrastructure. Because without the building or facility, then a lot of people won't be able to do anything. And then with the infrastructure, it'll be like your communications, your T1, your fiber, your connection to the internet, to the outside world of the network, your telephony, and then also your voice as well. One thing to do here, I know a lot of people are doing telecommuting. So they also have that provision for BCP. So if any disaster happens, a lot of times they'll send individuals home to be with their family or whatnot, but then hook up some sort of connection from their house to the organization, which could just be a simple VPN going to an offsite VPN concentrator, and then everybody communicates with that site, and that's going to be their quote-unquote hot site because it's always up and running, but it's going to be in a small building as opposed to the larger building everybody else was at. I've seen that happen a lot and has happened or been very successful in some instances. Okay, building and facilities. Many businesses require specialized facilities. You have your hardening, provisioning, and alternate sites. You definitely need to know the difference between a hot site, a warm site, and a cold site. How many people here have dealt with mobile sites? Mobile trailers, a lot of times they used to be considered your good old cold site because they may have equipment in there, but they didn't really have power. They didn't really have communications. But a lot of the mobile sites nowadays are quote-unquote command centers. Those are going to be your mobile hot sites because they already have, for example, satellite communications going directly to it. They have the computers up and running. They have really good communications back and forth. So a lot of organizations will have mobile hot sites nowadays. Okay, off-site facilities. Your hot site is ready for data processing in a few hours or less. Contains all necessary devices, software, equipment, just needs the people and the data backups. Annual tests are available and most expensive subscription option. With this being said, I know a lot of organizations that go through the tabletop exercises, or they'll do, for example, like parallel testing. And parallel testing basically means people will be at the hot site and they start doing the processing like the actual other system is no longer available. The problem with that, again, as I mentioned before, if you don't do the full failover test, is there's the possibility that there could be a break in communications, break in chains. So yes, they may be able to do everything up and running, but only in a virtual or testbed environment because you still have other processes that you don't see or that are unknowns that are still dependent on the main site. So they don't fall over to the secondary site. So not doing the full failover may potentially damage the organization when an actual event does occur. Okay, warm site. This is ready for data processing in a day or longer. Some peripheral devices needs to be populated with computers, devices, software, people, and data backups. So you may have your printers in place, your phone lines in place, you may have your basics, but it comes down to you have your vendor with a service contract that says, yes, we're going to need 100 computers within, let's say, a 24-hour period, or you actually go to your local Best Buy, CompUSA, Circuit City, or whatnot, and wipe out their entire computer stock just to build up your system right away. This is a lot cheaper than a hot site until an emergency happens. Then it can actually be a little bit more expensive because unless you have a good contract with a vendor for relatively inexpensive equipment, if you're buying things off the shelf, that could jack up the price.
A lot of times the insurance company will ultimately reimburse for that too.
Yeah, if you have good insurance. And that's the whole thing too as far as the BCP, the transferring of risk or making sure that you have a good insurance company is definitely a good thing. Yeah. Yeah. And that's another thing as far as the insurance goes, depending on the area that you're at. Some places, if you put your organization in a floodplain and you have your regular business insurance, that may or may not cover flood insurance. So you may have to get a secondary insurance. With that being said, whenever you go down to it, if you don't take that in consideration, it's going to be really good to have the credit because you're not going to get reimbursed. Definitely make sure, especially in this aspect, that all of the possibilities are, or the probabilities are taken care of. For example, again, back in Montana, the reason I keep bringing that up is spent time there. I didn't see very many tornadoes there. Blizzards I saw, but not really tornadoes. So if you had your flood insurance, your other insurance, fire insurance, but you didn't have insurance that specialized in that type of a natural event, if it did happen, that's a lot of companies just accepted the risk because they don't think that it would ever come to that point. Okay, cold site. Empty building, no equipment. You have electrical wiring, havoc systems, plumbing, and flooring. About 2 weeks to get into functional order. So again, the hot site's going to be hours, warm site's going to be days, and the cold site is going to be weeks. Okay, testing offsite facilities. Hardware and software should be tested for compatibility. One of the biggest issues, again, especially if you're doing a contract site, is that you're trying to co-locate with somebody else. A lot of times their equipment is not going to match up with yours. And if you have a specific security requirements to keep up and running, such as the current patches or be up to date to a certain level, there's a good chance that they probably aren't or they may not be. Or let's say if they're still on Windows 2000 and you're on XP, some of the software you have may not work on their hardware devices. It is critical that all components work together at the time of need. Basically, if an offsite facility where your company does not do software upgrades or technology refresh, compatibility must be verified. And also, can electronic vaulting or remote journaling cover offsite facilities? Now, you can do that in a lot of scenarios, especially if the offsite is going to be a hot site or a co-location site. Then, of course, your tape backups will be the warm site and the hot sites. You test equipment at the warm site, assuming that you may have some sort of server there that's going to be doing all the backup. And then, of course, the hot site, you're going to have probably people there. Let's say if you have a 24-hour organization, the main organization may have 80% of the population within a certain group, and the hot site may have 20% because it comes up to an actual secondary site. Okay, the plan approval. You need to gain top-level management endorsement of the plan. This is going to be, again, your C-level execs or your senior management. It's not going to be your medium management. Okay, be prepared to provide a lengthy explanation of the plan's purpose and specific provisions. Also, plan endorsed by the top execs in your business, the chief executive officer, chairman, president, or potentially any other items like your board of directors. Those are another group of individuals that definitely need to be taken into consideration. Okay, such an individual in the plan also gives it much greater weight and credibility in the eyes of senior managers. Okay, implementation. Develop an implementation schedule. Utilize the resources dedicated to the program. And the BCP, or Business Continuity Plan, team should be supervised, or supervise the implementation. Okay, when the plan is actually developed, that's going to be your due care. The due diligence is actually going to be going through the testing phases. The testing phases that are very important to know, again, are going to be like your tabletop test. So you get everybody going through there and going through scenarios. Your checklist tests, which would be we have everything accounted for. Let's say this legal regulation tells us we need to do A, B, C, and D. The checklist is going to say you're at least doing A, B, C, and D. Then your tabletop goes through and says, okay, what happens if there's a fire? What happens if there's a disgruntled employee, a pandemic, or whatnot? How do we deal with any of those scenarios? Then, of course, you're going to have your dry fire tests, then your parallel tests, and then so forth. Okay, characteristics. A test basically helps indicate if a company can actually recover. Tests should actually happen at least annually. If it does not happen annually, then a lot of people are going to forget how to do things. For example, you're going to have a lot of holes. If you have one admin in your group, let's say out of 5 people that actually know how to deal with the data recovery or the data backups, that's going to be a huge problem, especially if that individual is out of the loop. It either has to go home to the family or is potentially, God forbid, killed in the incident. Okay, identify the teams and items and individuals that need to be improved upon. Definitely expect mistakes, because especially the first runs, the people are going to mess up. They're not going to follow what's going to be on the paper, especially in real life. For example, if the building is on fire, there's a lot of individuals that probably are not going to walk calmly to the exit door. They may walk quickly to the exit door or run to the exit door. So you have to expect the simple things like people tripping, helping people up, items like that. How to move forward. Decide upon the type of drill to perform. Create a disaster scenario. Fire drills are probably one of the more common ones that you'll see because they're relatively easy to drill for. You run the drill and report results to management. Same thing with, for example, internet loss as far as data recovery goes. You can basically go through, you can plan the drill, and then you can do a simple ACL, shut off the router, make it to where the traffic's not going back and forth, and then time to see how long it takes for the other system to pick up the slack. I know this one entity is rather interesting. It was a commercial entity. And the main reason that they tested and perfected their BCP plan for their disaster recovery, at least, just because they were actually getting attacked by an outside entity. What ended up happening, one of their competitors actually hired somebody within the ISP or their upstream provider. So every time at about, was it 5:30 on Fridays, their internet would go down for 30 minutes to an hour or so. So the person was actually shutting off the connection because that's when a lot of the contracts, I guess, were starting to be signed and pushed out or whatnot. And what ended up happening was after the first time, they were down for a day trying to figure out what was going on. And then after about the third or fourth time, they had it to where their secondary office, if there was any latency whatsoever with the prime, instantly failed over and went over to the other network. So definitely it's a good idea to sometimes test those things because bad things can happen. You have your checklist test, copies of the BCP plan. It's distributed to functional managers. They review the parts that address their department. There's the walkthrough test. It's basically is a meeting held where functional managers come together and go through the plan and basically discuss what their responsibilities are and see if there's any gaps or missing items in there.
Is that what you've been calling tabletop?
Yeah, it's usually a tabletop where people go through and they discuss gap analysis, yeah. Simulation test is you actually carry out a disaster scenario, continues up to the actual relocation of an offsite facility and individuals. This right here could even have it to where you go through your drill and then you actually have to bus people from point A to point B. The basics of logistics is a huge problem, especially in a real emergency, because you have to take into consideration if it's a geographic event that the roads are going to be congested. So a lot of people will actually build their organization next to an airport, which could be both good or bad depending on the event. So they can have a lot less time getting from point A to the airport, and then from the airport, which is point B, to point C, which is going to be their off-site location. There's also parallel test. Some systems are transported to the off-site facility for parallel processing. Usually that's going to be the data. And then full interruption test. The original site is shut down either off the internet or completely closed. Okay, what is a success? A plan is considered valid and effective if responses within acceptable time frames. For example, let's say if you're shooting to have everybody out of the building within 10 minutes on a fire drill. If it takes 15 minutes, then basically the next fire drill, you're going to have to shoot forward that. You also want to make sure that if it does take 15 minutes, you want to see why it took 15 minutes. If it was because people just didn't hear the alarm, if places were blocked, if certain doors weren't opening properly. So you want to make sure that as far as the building is concerned and everything's running perfectly. But then it may just be you're training the personnel to actually get up out of their chair, close things down. I have been in environments, though, to where it was suggested that you at least log your system off before you leave your current environment. Because that's one thing, especially with a fire drill, in a real fire scenario. In real life, fires can happen through man-made content or items, and they may start a fire or set the fire drill to get people out of an environment so they can go in and then steal data. So basically it's a distraction technique. But response times, if you do hit your 10-minute mark, it's always a good idea to say, okay, let's not only keep it there, let's try to increase it as well. You always want to try to improve on the last test. Key operations at alternate locations are adequate. Backups can be successfully restored. Again, in the backup tapes, huge problem. A lot of times people don't read the error messages. A lot of times when you're doing a dual journaling, people aren't actually looking at the data on the other side. So when it is dumping it over there, it could be completely garbage. It could be destroyed data, so they can't actually use it. Emergency personnel, service personnel, and contractors can be reached within acceptable time frames. I know many organizations that go through and they have secondary backups, basically meaning contractors to where, again, if a geographic event happens and their main site location is no longer viable, then they can call people all across the country or world or whatnot to come into specific areas. And it would be a temporary basis. So some of the contractors, not just for buildings and things like that, but actually employment. You also have team members who are aware of specific actions to occur and how they're supposed to occur. Team members are able to perform associated duties, and multiple team members are supposed to do these specific duties. I've seen several call rosters. For example, if an event were to happen, what their responsibility was to do was to call 3 to 4 people, because they will get one of those 4 people within that scenario, and if they don't, they just keep on going down the chain. Once they get, say, 2 or 3 people contacted, those 2 or 3 people are supposed to call 3 or 4 other people, and then just so forth, to where, in theory, everybody on the team is supposed to be notified of the event, and then it also goes to the upper management. So if the first person cannot get to person A, B, C, and D, they also release that information to the people that they talk to, saying I can't get to person A, B, C, and D, and I also tried calling upstream as well. And also, plan is current and relevant. Okay, BCP plans quickly become outdated. It's because technology changes and software is upgraded. So you may have your good old disaster recovery, saying this is how you restore the data. But again, if you used to have zip disks and now you're going through tape backups or CD or some sort of SAN, then the restore process is going to be completely different. Companies merge with other companies or splits. Mergers are definitely fun. Plan is treated as a one-time project instead of an ongoing process, and that is going to show the due care that it was built, but there is no due diligence in that aspect. Okay, personnel turnover. And that's another reason why you really want to test these things at least annually, and manually, because not only are you going to have personnel turnover, but the retraining issue, but a lot of areas have a lot of attrition within their organization, especially depending if it's a huge contracting organization or whatnot. They may have, say, 80–90% of the people that were there a year ago have been replaced by others. Okay, also, how to keep the plan current. Make someone or a group responsible. That's one thing that is the basic part of information security when it comes down to roles and responsibilities. Works in basically every domain of the CISSP, things like that, to where if somebody is the DMARC, if something fails, they are ultimately responsible for that failure. So they can't say it wasn't me, I didn't know, it wasn't my responsibility, it was theirs. If it's a benefit, that's another thing, is if it actually works, of course, that's good for them, but somebody needs to be held responsible for the failure or the upgrade of it. Integrate plan into the company audits. Implement a change control tool that takes the BCP into consideration as well. Because again, if you're doing the change control in the organization, you're adding a bunch of software, that needs to be in the BCP as well. Okay, phase plan. You have your project initiation, you have your BIA, business impact analysis, strategic development, plan development, of course your implementation, and the testing and maintenance. Sometimes the testing and maintenance, even though this is supposed to evolve, but if the organization changes drastically, such as the merger or the split, you may have to go through the entire process again. So you may actually have to start at the project initiation and move back down, especially if you go to a new geographic area. A lot of places that I've actually seen, not only just do your basic BCBs, but they have the call roster list, but they'll also have a call roster list on their person. For example, they may have an encrypted file, let's say on a business CD that they keep in their wallet, and the encrypted file would have the contact information for, say, the top 25 individuals. I know a lot of people also can sometimes have on their lanyard some emergency contacts, such as, of course, your local fire, sheriff or law enforcement, hospitals, ambulances, items like that. Okay, who's ready? Or how many companies are truly prepared for a disaster? In all honesty, it's the majority of them never think it's going to happen to them, or that the budget's just not there to do the true testing. So when it comes down to it, very few people are. But there are organizations where they train on this every day, to where when it does come down to it, there's little effect to them. But yeah, the majority of them, it's a huge problem, especially in the commercial sector.